Right now you feel stuck, uncertain, maybe exhausted. But before this video ends, you can feel the quiet certainty of someone who already knows it is done. Neville addressed this directly, though most people skim past it because it sounds almost too simple. He made it clear that assumption is not something you do to reality, it is something you live from, and this distinction changes everything. Doing implies effort, time, repetition, and correction. Living from implies position, authority, and inevitability. Neville once compared this to the difference between wearing a suit and being appointed to an office. Anyone can put on the clothing, rehearse the gestures, and mimic the behavior, but none of that grants authority. Authority precedes action. The appointment comes first and behavior follows naturally. In the same way, assumption works not when you perform it convincingly, but when your inner position has already shifted. This is why one of the most misunderstood moments in manifestation is the period where it feels like nothing is happening. People assume this is failure, regression, or proof that the law does not work for them. Neville taught the opposite. He explained that when assumption begins to stabilize, the outer world often goes quiet. There is no immediate feedback, no emotional fireworks, no visible movement. And this silence is not a mistake. It is evidence that the inner state is no longer being questioned. When the mind stops checking, measuring, and correcting, it often feels empty, even dull. But this is precisely the condition in which assumption takes root. Modern neuroscience echoes this principle in a different language. Dr. Joe Dispenza has pointed out that repetition without identity change produces no new outcomes. A person can repeat thoughts and behaviors endlessly, but if the underlying self-concept remains the same, the body and brain simply reinforce the old pattern. This is why effort eventually leads to burnout. The system is being asked to produce a new result while remaining the same identity. Neville was saying this decades earlier. Without the scientific terminology, you cannot become what you want by visiting the state occasionally. You become it by relocating your sense of self. What this video is designed to do is not to add another technique to your list, but to remove the very reason you feel the need to keep searching. There is one shift, quiet, subtle, and often anticlimactic, that makes assumption automatic rather than forced. When that shift occurs, you stop managing the process and start occupying the position. The law no longer feels like something you must remember to apply. It feels like something that is already operating because you are already the one it applies to. And once that is understood, the struggle that brought you here begins to dissolve on its own. At first, practicing assumption feels responsible. It feels disciplined, even mature, to tell yourself that consistency is the key and that repetition will eventually produce mastery. But hidden inside the word practice is an implication that quietly undermines everything Neville was pointing to. Practice always assumes distance. You practice what you are not yet. You rehearse what you do not yet officially occupy. And the longer assumption is framed as something you practice, the longer the mind confirms that the desired state is elsewhere, ahead of you, conditional upon improvement. This is why so many sincere students feel as though they are circling the truth without landing in it. They rehearse the state of being loved, wealthy, secure, or free, in the same way an actor rehearses a role they have not yet been cast in. The rehearsal may be accurate, emotional, and even convincing, but it never carries authority. Authority does not come from repetition, it comes from appointment. When a role is officially yours, you do not practice it, you inhabit it, you move from it, you make decisions from it, without checking whether you are doing it correctly. Neville made this distinction clear when he emphasized that assumption hardens into fact only when it feels natural. Naturalness is impossible when you are practicing because practice requires self-observation. You are constantly watching yourself to see if you are assuming properly, affirming enough, imagining vividly enough. This creates a split in consciousness, one part trying to become and another part supervising the attempt. That supervision is not neutral. It quietly reinforces the idea that the state has not yet been secured. The frustration people feel is not because assumption does not work, but because the identity they return to between sessions remains unchanged. They assume for 10 minutes, then return to the familiar sense of self that wonders when it will work. Over time, the mind learns the pattern. It learns that assumption is an activity you visit, not a position you live from. And so life reflects exactly that. Temporary emotional shifts followed by familiar circumstances. This is the disruption that must occur if assumption is ever going to become effortless. When practicing stops producing results, it is not an invitation to try harder. It is a signal to look beneath the technique and examine the identity that keeps reaching for it. Neville was not teaching better methods of rehearsal. He was pointing to a complete relocation of self. Until that relocation happens, practice will always feel necessary, and effort will always feel justified. And that is precisely the state that keeps assumption from becoming real. There is a moment, subtle and often overlooked, where assumption reverses its entire function. Up until this point, it feels like something you must hold in place, something that requires attention, reinforcement, and emotional maintenance. But Neville pointed to a level where assumption no longer feels active at all. It becomes quiet, ordinary, almost unnoticeable. And this is where its creative power actually begins. Conscious effort fades not because you gave up, but because the state no longer needs defending. Naturalness is the signal that creation is complete. Not excitement, not intensity, not emotional charge. Naturalness. Neville emphasized this repeatedly because nothing feels more threatening to the old self than simplicity. The mind expects transformation to feel dramatic, yet the most profound shifts often feel boring. When assumption is real, it stops announcing itself. You do not feel like you are doing anything special. You simply think, speak, and respond from a position that no longer needs justification. This is why Neville compared the state to walking. You do not think about each step. You do not affirm that your legs will work. You do not visualize the floor meeting your feet. Walking happens because the identity of someone who can walk is settled. The moment you had to consciously manage each movement would be the moment something had gone wrong. In the same way, assumption only feels strained when identity is unstable. Effort is not proof of power, it is proof of transition. What most people miss is that consciousness does not shift forward through force, but downward into familiarity. The state becomes effective when it sinks beneath awareness and installs itself as the default reference point. This is why people often report that manifestations arrive after they stopped thinking about them, not because forgetting caused the result, but because forgetting was the evidence that the state had already become normal. The mind stopped checking because there was nothing left to verify. This reversal is unsettling for those who equate control with success. When assumption becomes unconscious, it feels like you are doing less, not more. There is less mental activity, fewer inner conversations, and far less emotional management. Yet life begins to reorganize anyway. Neville explained that the law operates most efficiently when the conscious mind is no longer interfering. Naturalness emerges only after identity stabilizes, and identity stabilizes only when you stop treating the state as something fragile. At this stage, assumption no longer feels like a technique you might lose if you stop paying attention. It feels like the way things are. And once that happens, consciousness no longer needs to be convinced. It moves on. It lives. It expresses itself without commentary. This is the great reversal. Assumption fulfills itself not when it is held tightly in awareness, but when it becomes so familiar that awareness lets go. For years, visualization and emotion have been treated as the engines of manifestation, but Neville was precise in his language for a reason. He did not say that imagining creates reality. He said that imagining from the right position does. The difference is subtle but decisive. Visualization and emotion are effects, not causes. They rise and fall depending on the state you occupy, and no amount of emotional intensity can compensate for an unstable self-concept. When identity remains unchanged, techniques merely decorate the surface of consciousness without altering its direction. Identity is the silent decision about who you are that you stop revisiting. It is not a thought you repeat, nor a feeling you generate on demand. It is the background setting that determines what thoughts feel reasonable and what emotions feel appropriate. Neville understood this when he spoke of self-concept as the cause of all phenomena. Life does not respond to what you want or what you imagine occasionally. It responds to what you assume yourself to be when you are not trying. A useful way to understand this is through the idea of access. Identity functions like a login credential. Once it is accepted, access is granted automatically. You do not need to explain yourself to the system. You do not need to negotiate. Certain experiences simply become available, while others fade into irrelevance. Visualization does not grant access, it reflects it. Emotion does not unlock the door, it signals that the door has already been opened. When people try to force feeling without changing identity, they are asking the system to respond without valid credentials. This is why Neville warned against worshipping techniques. Techniques are temporary bridges, not permanent residences. They are useful only insofar as they assist the shift of identity beneath conscious thought. The moment a technique becomes the focus, identity becomes secondary and the process stalls. You can imagine wealth vividly and still feel like someone who is waiting. You can feel love intensely and still return to the assumption of being without it. Identity is installed below thought, and anything that does not reach that level cannot produce lasting change. Once identity shifts, effort collapses. Thoughts reorganize themselves without supervision. Emotional responses align naturally. Even inner conversations change tone, not because you are managing them, but because there is no longer a reason to argue with reality. Neville was pointing to this lever when he emphasized being rather than becoming. When the lever moves, the whole structure responds. And until it does, nothing else truly matters. If this feels familiar, stay with it. Subscribe, and let assumptions stop being theory and start being natural. Neville described the state akin to sleep not as a manifestation ritual, but as a doorway into a different level of self. This distinction is critical because most people approach SATs as a tool to produce results, rather than as a condition in which identity can be quietly transferred. In SATs, the conscious mind loosens its grip, not through force, but through fatigue and surrender. The body relaxes, the critical faculty softens, and the sense of self becomes more fluid. It is in this fluidity that assumption stops being negotiated and begins to be accepted. The power of SATs lies in what it bypasses. When you are fully awake, the mind evaluates, compares, and corrects. It questions whether something is realistic, deserved, or consistent with past experience. In SATs, those functions dim. Neville understood that identity cannot be argued into place. It must be received. This is why he emphasized entering the state nightly, not to repeat images mechanically, but to allow a new sense of self to sink below the surface where resistance no longer has access. A useful analogy is updating an operating system while the screen is off. The most important changes happen when nothing appears to be happening. You do not watch each file install, and you do not interfere with the process. You simply allow the update to run. SATs operates in the same way. The imaginal act is not the point, it is the carrier. What installs is the feeling of being the one for whom the scene is normal. When that feeling is accepted, even briefly, identity begins to reorganize itself without conscious effort. After this installation, the mind often tests the change. Old thoughts may surface. External circumstances may remain unchanged for a time. This is not a failure of SATs, but a natural response to a shift in identity. The system checks for consistency, not to sabotage you, but to confirm stability. Neville explained that persistence is not about repeating the act with strain, but about refusing to abandon the new position simply because it has not yet been reflected. When SATs is understood in this way, it ceases to feel like a nightly obligation and becomes a place of rest. You are no longer trying to make something happen. You're allowing yourself to fall asleep as someone different, even if only slightly. And that difference, accepted in stillness, does more to establish assumption as the default than any amount of waking effort ever could. There comes a stage in the process that feels more unsettling than doubt, more discouraging than resistance, and more confusing than contradiction. It is the stage where nothing responds. The imaginal act has been entered, the inner position has shifted, and yet the outer world remains unchanged, almost indifferent. No confirmations appear. No symbolic movement presents itself. Life continues as if nothing new has been assumed at all. Neville identified this moment not as a setback, but as a threshold, and understanding it correctly is what determines whether assumption stabilizes or collapses back into the old identity. The mind has been conditioned to associate progress with feedback. From an early age, reinforcement comes through visible response. Effort produces result. Action produces reaction. When assumption moves beyond conscious effort and into identity, that familiar loop is interrupted. The world does not immediately mirror the change because the old state is still dissolving. This gap creates discomfort, not because something is wrong, But because the former identity no longer has its usual reference points, the silence feels threatening precisely because it removes the evidence the old self relied on to confirm its reality. Neville explained that this silence is not absence but suspension. The outer world pauses not to deny the assumption, but to reorganize itself in accordance with it. When assumption is unstable, reality responds quickly, reflecting inconsistency with mixed results. When assumption begins to harden, response slows. The delay is not punishment, it is coherence. The system waits until the inner position is settled before rearranging itself. In this way, silence becomes a sign of depth, not failure. The difficulty arises when the mind interprets this stillness as a problem to solve. The impulse to check, adjust, or restart techniques emerges, disguised as responsibility or refinement. Yet every reaction to silence reaffirms the belief that the outer world is the authority that grants permission for inner stability. Neville warned that reacting to appearances is the mechanism by which the old state survives. Reaction is not neutral. It is an act of identification. To react is to say without words that nothing has changed yet. The analogy of the seed is more than poetic. It is structurally accurate. When a seed is planted, the first visible activity is not growth, but disintegration. The shell breaks open in darkness. If exposed too early, the process fails. The soil's stillness is not inactivity, it is protection. In the same way, the period where nothing appears to be happening is when the former self-concept is breaking apart. The old assumptions lose cohesion. The new identity begins to organize itself beneath awareness. Interference at this stage only restores the familiar structure. Neville emphasized that faith is not emotional confidence or optimistic expectation. Faith is non-reaction. It is the refusal to interpret silence as evidence against the assumption. This is why the final test rarely looks dramatic. It looks ordinary. Days pass. Conversations repeat. Circumstances appear unchanged. And yet, something subtle has shifted. The inner position is no longer negotiating. The question of whether it will work begins to fade, not because it has been answered, but because it no longer feels relevant. Those who pass through this stage often do so without realizing it at the time. They stop monitoring not as an act of discipline, but because there is nothing left to monitor. The assumption has ceased to feel fragile. It no longer needs emotional reinforcement or mental defense. When this happens, the old identity has no ground to stand on. It dissolves quietly, without conflict, because it is no longer being fed attention. This is why manifestations that follow this phase often arrive suddenly and without build-up. There is no gradual emotional escalation, no dramatic climax. Life simply rearranges itself as if it had always been moving in that direction. Neville described this as the natural outpicturing of a settled assumption. The delay was not waiting for reality to change, but waiting for you to stop returning to who you were. When nothing is happening, the final separation is taking place, and once it is complete, the outer world has no choice but to agree. Once assumption has settled beneath awareness, life begins to move in ways that feel oddly unspectacular. There is no announcement, no inner signal that something has started, and no sense that a process has been activated. Events simply begin to line up, not as miracles, but as ordinary occurrences that somehow lead exactly where they need to go. Neville referred to this unfolding as the bridge of incidents, emphasizing that it is not something the conscious mind plans, directs, or even understands while it is happening. What makes the bridge so difficult to recognize is its normality. Each step appears reasonable on its own, even unrelated to the desired outcome. Conversations happen casually. Opportunities arise without drama. Decisions are made without inner debate. Only in retrospect does the pattern become visible. Neville explained that this is by design. If the bridge were obvious, the conscious mind would attempt to manage it, and in doing so, collapse the very naturalness that allows it to function. Monitoring interferes because it reintroduces the old identity. The moment you watch for evidence, you imply that the assumption is still uncertain. This does not stop life from moving, but it distorts the path. Instead of unfolding cleanly, the bridge becomes cluttered with effort, hesitation, and second-guessing. Neville was clear that the law does not require supervision. Once the inner position is established, the outer world reorganizes itself automatically, without consultation. The analogy of email syncing captures this precisely. Once logged in, messages update on their own. You do not refresh the inbox every few seconds to make the system work. In fact, constant refreshing slows the process and creates the illusion of delay. The system functions best when left alone. In the same way, the bridge of incidents activates when the assumption is accepted as a fact, not when it is treated as a possibility that must be checked. What often confuses people is that the bridge does not always align with their expectations. The route may feel indirect. The timing may seem inconvenient. Certain events may even appear to contradict the desired outcome at first glance. Neville cautioned against interpreting any single event along the bridge as meaningful on its own. Each incident is part of a larger reconfiguration that only makes sense once the end is reached. Judging the process midstream is like criticizing a sentence before it is finished. This is why those who truly live from assumption often report a sense of ease rather than excitement. There is movement, but no tension. Life feels active yet unforced. Decisions are made without the weight of consequence because the outcome is no longer in question. The bridge does not feel like a path you are walking deliberately. It feels like life happening naturally while somehow taking care of itself. Neville's insistence on non-interference was not a call to passivity, but a recognition of order. When assumption is real, the role of the conscious mind is not to manage events, but to participate in them as they arise. Action still occurs, but it arises from the new identity rather than from a need to make something happen. And when action flows from that place, it carries no strain. Eventually, the bridge completes itself, often so quietly that it feels anticlimactic. The desired state simply appears as the next logical step in a series of ordinary moments. There is no sense of arrival, only recognition. This is the signature of assumption fulfilled. Results that feel inevitable rather than earned, and a path that required no monitoring because it never needed permission to unfold. Neville used the word Sabbath in a way that stripped it of ritual and returned it to its original psychological meaning. It was not a day of worship nor a moral obligation, but a state of rest that follows completion. In Scripture, creation ends before rest begins, not because effort has failed, but because nothing more is required. Neville applied this directly to assumption. When the inner act is finished, there is a natural cessation of striving. The mind stops reaching, correcting, and reinforcing, not because of discipline, but because the work is done. This rest feels unfamiliar to those who are accustomed to effort. There is often an impulse to support the assumption with affirmations, techniques, or constant inner dialogue, as if leaving it alone would cause it to disappear. Neville taught the opposite. The need to support an assumption is evidence that it has not yet been accepted as true. Truth does not require maintenance, it stands on its own. When assumption reaches the Sabbath, it no longer feels fragile, it feels settled. The analogy of the oven captures this state precisely. When a meal is placed inside and the timer is set, there is no benefit to opening the door repeatedly to check on it. Doing so only disrupts the process and prolongs completion. Trust in the timer is not blind faith. It is understanding how the system works. In the same way, Sabbath is not passivity or resignation. It is confidence rooted in knowing that the imaginal act has already done its work. What often surprises people is that the Sabbath does not feel triumphant. There is no rush of certainty, no emotional high, no sense of victory. It feels quiet, ordinary, almost indistinguishable from indifference. Neville emphasized that this neutrality is the mark of completion. When the desire no longer dominates attention, it is because it has been psychologically satisfied. The mind moves on naturally, not because it has given up, but because it has accepted. This rest reveals something deeper than the manifestation itself. When techniques fall away and the impulse to check dissolves, what remains is not emptiness but identity. The self that no longer needs to manage reality begins to emerge. Neville saw the Sabbath as a revelation of being rather than an outcome. It exposes the fact that effort was never the cause, only a transitional phase. Once identity settles, effort becomes unnecessary. Many people misinterpret this stage as loss of interest or lack of commitment. In reality, it is the point at which commitment is no longer conscious. The assumption has moved beneath awareness, where it operates automatically. This is why Neville warned against restarting techniques once rest has arrived. Returning to effort at this stage is not persistence, it is regression. It signals a return to the old identity that believed something still needed to be done. In the Sabbath, life feels lighter, not because circumstances have necessarily changed yet, but because the inner struggle has ended. Decisions are made without urgency. Thoughts no longer circle the desire. There is a subtle confidence that does not announce itself. Neville described this as entering into rest, where the law is allowed to express itself without interference. The conscious mind steps aside, not out of defeat, but out of understanding. This state is often brief and easy to overlook, yet it is decisive. Once the Sabbath is reached, the assumption is sealed. The outer world may still appear unchanged for a time, but the inner verdict has been rendered. From this point forward, results are not created. They are revealed, and they arrive not because they are being demanded, but because nothing remains within to resist them. There comes a point where the focus on results begins to soften, not because desire has failed, but because something more fundamental has shifted. The outcome that once felt urgent loses its emotional charge, and in its place arises a quieter awareness. Neville pointed to this moment as the deeper purpose of assumption, the stage where the individual begins to sense that manifestation was never the final aim, but a doorway to self-recognition. Up to this point, assumption has been treated as a method for changing circumstances. Success was measured by external confirmation, and identity was reinforced by what appeared to happen in the world. But as assumption stabilizes, this relationship reverses. Circumstances no longer define the self. They become reflections rather than validators. Neville insisted that the law exists to reveal the one who is assuming, not merely to produce effects. When this is understood, the compulsion to monitor results naturally diminishes. This shift often feels subtle. There is no dramatic realization, no emotional climax. Instead, there is a gentle collapse of seeking. The mind no longer searches for proof in the outer world, because the inner position has settled. The question quietly changes from when will it happen to who is aware of wanting it. In that shift, the sense of separation between the self and experience begins to dissolve. The assumption is no longer about becoming something. It is about recognizing what has been present all along. Neville referred to this recognition as I am, not as a philosophical concept, but as a direct sense of being that exists prior to conditions and outcomes. When this awareness is touched even briefly, the relationship with desire changes. Wanting no longer carries tension. Manifestation becomes expressive rather than compensatory. States are entered and exited without confusion, because identity is no longer fused to them. This does not mean that results stop occurring. Life continues to respond to inner assumptions with precision. What changes is the emotional dependence on outcomes. Success no longer inflates the self, and delay no longer threatens it. Neville emphasized that when I am is known, the individual moves through states with freedom. Assumption becomes a function, not a fixation. What makes this stage decisive is its simplicity. Nothing new is added. No technique is refined. Something is merely seen clearly for the first time. The awareness that has been assuming states recognizes itself as the source. In that recognition, effort falls away, and with it, the sense that something was missing. Beyond results, assumption completes its work by revealing being itself. The journey that began with desire ends in recognition. Not recognition of achievement, but recognition of presence. And from that place, creation continues naturally, without strain, because it is no longer being used to define who you are. Neville's teaching resolves into a single recognition. Results do not come from doing assumption, but from being the assumer. The moment assumption is treated as an action, identity is placed in the future. When it becomes a position, effort naturally ends. Mastery is not intensity, but quiet continuity, the state that operates even when you are no longer thinking about it. Like a mirror, life reflects only what has already settled as identity. This is why lasting change always follows self-concept, a point echoed in modern language by Dr. Joe Dispenza. When being comes first, reflection is inevitable. Rest is not neglect, it is completion.